right. Well, let's get started again. So, last hour I discussed the 1,000-mile hike I took across Oregon, and we're all exhausted from that. And so now I want to do something that's a lot easier. It's called Hiking Oregon's History, but notice that the word hiking is in tiny letters up there. There's a reason for that. This is a book where you don't have to do any hiking. It's just if you get caught up in one of the stories, it tells how you could drive to these places and see where the event happened. And if you want, you can get out of the car and walk around and get the feeling of the place as well. But you really don't have to. And what I wanted to do was do a book that told the whole human history of Oregon, 14,000 years of history in one book, and now I'm going to do it in 40 minutes. So obviously we're going to hit some highlights here and skip a few things. For one thing we're going to skip is all this information about my other books, which we've already heard about. And then we'll go back to what Oregon looked like 14,000 years ago. And I picked that date for a good reason. Just recently, archaeologists from the University of Oregon uncovered the earliest proof of humans anywhere in the Americas, and it's in Oregon. At Paisley Caves in eastern Oregon, they were able to find coprolites that they could date to carbon date to 14,300 years old. Anybody know what coprolites are? Yeah, shit. Right, okay. Well, that's true. These are dried human feces, and you think, big deal, they found some old poop. But, but a turd can be valuable too to an archaeologist because it could not only carbon date it, but also take DNA from it and prove that it was human. So this is the earliest evidence of humans. Well, what was Oregon like 14,300 years ago? Well, that would have been at the end of the Ice Age. And the Ice Age brought snow and ice to the mountains of Oregon, but to eastern Oregon it brought rain. And so instead of a desert, it was a savanna, a grasslands with huge lakes, some of them 50 miles across and hundreds of feet deep, connected to the ocean with salmon in them. It was a very different place and more hospitable. If you go to Hart Mountain today, you'll see remnants of those lakes. These are the Warner Lakes. They're little shallow alkali puddles. But on the slope of Hart Mountain, you can see the old lakeshore like a bathtub ring, 200 feet higher. This lake stretched 50 miles to the west, and at the far end of it was the evidence of the first humans. And the first real proof of this came in the 1930s when Luther Cressman, also from the University of Oregon, found sandals at the Fort Rock Cave. And so we're going to talk about them. These are dated to about 10,000 years old, but they astonished the world at the time. This was in the 30s. They didn't have carbon dating, but he found them underneath a layer of ash from Mount Mazama when it had blown up to create Crater Lake, which meant they had to be older than the eruption of Crater Lake, which they know was 7,000 years ago. This totally upset the view that Indians had arrived in America only 1,000 years ago. They obviously have been here much, much longer, and it turns out longer than that. And it wasn't just 2 sandals, it was 70, an entire collection, all different sizes, in this cave at Fort Rock. And Fort Rock did not always look like this. It looks like a castle in the desert now with steep walls. But originally, this is an volcanic explosion crater. Basically a cinder cone, and it had sloping sides originally, but it was in this lake, and the lake shore, the waves of the lake eroded away the sloping sides and left it looking like a castle in the desert. If that seems hard to believe, go there and walk to the edge, and you will see the bathtub ring. This is a notch 200 feet above the desert floor, carved by the waves of the lake. And these waves also undercut soft layers and left overhangs. And that is where they found these caves. These are not great big, long, deep caves. They're just overhangs, but they'd be a place to get out of the weather beside this beautiful lake, which would be a great place for early people to live. The Fort Rock Cave itself is over here next door. It's surrounded by a private ranch, so you need permission to go there. But you can go to this state park at Fort Rock and go up to a viewpoint and see the cave just fine. So let's do that. You want to do this in spring or in fall, not in the heat of summer. It's blazing hot, everything's dead. If you go in April or May, you'll see flowers blooming like this Oregon sunshine. And then you'll get to this viewpoint where you're looking out to Fort Rock Cave. And this was originally a peninsula sticking out into the lake with an overhang that provided shelter. What a glorious spot to hunt for birds and all the animals that would come down to drink at the lake. And you had water and shelter, and it's in the dry climate of eastern Oregon, and so the artifacts there have been preserved much better than artifacts in the rainy western part of the state. Well, the first history of Oregon was not written, but rather spoken. These would be oral legends, and the oldest legend that may have a basis in historical fact is the one told by the Klamath tribe in southern Oregon about the origin of Crater Lake. This was 7,700 years ago that Mount Mazama blew up to create Crater Lake. Could that story, that oral legend of the creation of the lake, be actually remembered by the tribe for that long? That would be 3 times longer than the stories in the Bible were retold before they were written down. Well, let's look at the legend and you can decide for yourself. Of course, Crater Lake today is basically a big hole in the ground filled with water, but the legend says it originally looked like this. This is Mount Shasta. It's 14,000 feet tall, but it's about the same size and shape as Mount Mazama would have been. But the Klamath tribe said that an evil spirit named Lau lived in this, and that was his wigwam, and he was always getting into trouble. There was a good spirit named Skell on a different mountain, but Lau was here, and one year he got it into his head that he wanted to marry the most beautiful maiden in the Klamath tribe, asked her to marry him, and she said no. I mean, really, an evil demon? Probably not the best match. So in response, Lau blew his top. He decided he would blow up his mountain and rain fiery rock on the tribe to kill everybody in the tribe in revenge. And the legend said that the only people in the tribe who survived the fall of fiery rock were the people who dived into Klamath Lake and breathed through reeds until the fire fall was over. And in fact, a couple of feet of pumice, flaming pumice, did land in that area. It would have killed anybody who wasn't in the lake. So it makes you think that this legend may have some basis in fact. But the legend is not over at that point, because it says that Lau was still there, and he went to the top of Lau Rock. This is the tallest cliff at the edge of Crater Lake. And up at the top there, he was gloating about his defeat of trying to rain fire on the Klamath tribe, and Skell, the good god, came up to do battle with him. The two of them wrestled up there at the top, the two gods, and for days and nights they battled, and everybody hidden with terror. And finally, Skell threw the evil god, Lau, into the lake to drown him and end his troublemaking forever, except the legend says that he is coming back, and that Wizard Island is his head poking back up as Lau is coming back up to cause more mischief. Well, you can go hike now onto the head of Lau if you want. There is only one trail that goes down to the shore of Crater Lake. It's a mile, but it's downhill, and you got to remember that because you have to go back uphill on the way back. And then you can get in these boats, and they're charging like $60 or something for the trip now. It's enough to make you think maybe they shouldn't be running diesel motors on such a pure lake. But if you do get in, they pack in 40 people in this roofless thing and take you over to Wizard Island. For an extra $5, you can get off at Wizard Island. And not very many people do this. And I think it's not just the $5, it's thinking, can I get a ride back? They actually keep very careful count of the people that get off on Wizard Island because camping there is illegal. So they want to make sure they get you home. Well, if you do go up to the top of Wizard Island, you'll find a crater at the top. And this is a real crater at the top of this cinder cone. Geologists have 2 words for mountains with holes in the top of them. If it's a small mountain that's being built up, and has a hole at the top, that's a crater. If it's a big mountain that collapsed and left a hole, that's a caldera. They should really rename this Caldera Lake National Park. But then when you get back on the boat, it will take you around the other island in Crater Lake, Phantom Ship. And this is the oldest rock visible at Crater Lake. It's the old throat of the volcano. And the lava in that throat was so hard that when the mountain blew up, it left this spire sticking out from the edge. The real way to see Crater Lake without the crowds and the most beautiful time is in winter. They do not plow the road around the rim. So it's 33 miles to get around that lake. I've done this twice on skis, and 15 years apart. And it took me 3 days, 3 days to get around the first time, and 4 days the second, because I think they've made the lake bigger as we get older. And it turns out it's a fairly dangerous trek because there's no shortcut back if you get tired on the far side. There's no cell phone coverage, and there is avalanche danger. But this is the way that you get some fabulous views of the lake, and I think maybe can still glimpse the evil spirit. Maybe you have to turn your head sideways. I imagine seeing this frowning spirit in the lake. Maybe I'm making that up. But I think there is a lot of truth to the legend the Klamaths have of the origin of Crater Lake. The other legend that has a basis in geologic fact, but doesn't seem very likely, is the story of the Bridge of the Gods. And this was, the legend says that there was a way to cross the Columbia River dry-footed long ago. And the pioneers laughed at this because it is physically impossible to have a stone bridge that arches across a mile-wide river. That cannot happen. So what was it? And as it turns out, hikers have been crossing the ruins of this bridge for years. So let's look at the legend. The legend says that in the early days of the Oregon country, the Great Spirit started populating the country with two tribes, the Klickitats in the north and the Multnomas in the south. And he put this big river between them so they wouldn't fight. But then he thought, but there should be a way for them to communicate in peace. And so he built a bridge of the gods where you could cross the river dry-footed to commune between the two tribes. But then another evil spirit showed up. There were a lot back then. This one was female. Her name was Luit. And she set up camp in the middle of the Bridge of the Gods, turned herself into a beautiful maiden, and drove the chiefs of the two tribes wild with jealousy. They started a big war. The Great Spirit got angry, and he turned all the principal characters into mountains to try to cool them off. The idea was that if they were mountains, they would fight less. And so he turned the troublesome but beautiful Luit into Mount St. Helens, and I think her troublesome nature has come out more recently. And he turned the head of the Multnoma tribe, whose name was Wy'east, into Mount Hood. Its native name is still Wy'east. And the head of the Clackamas tribe, he turned into Mount Adams, which is still out there in the, not Clackamas, the Klickitat tribe, is still out there in Klickitat country, Mount Adams. But this did not stop the gods from fighting. Mount Hood and Mount Adams kept fighting over the beautiful Mount St. Helens. They hurled lava bombs across the river at each other and started great earthquakes, and one of these destroyed the Bridge of the Gods, and that was the end of peace in the Oregon country. Okay, there's the legend. Sound credible? No. And yet, when you look at the modern Bridge of the Gods, which is this steel structure from the 20s there at Cascade Locks, you notice that the river does a big bend to the south right there. Bonneville Dam uses that bend. Well, that bend was not there 700 years ago. The whole thing is a landslide from Table Mountain. And you can see a very fresh scarp up here. 700 years ago, half the mountain slid down. The largest landslide known in Oregon came down and dammed the Columbia River for up to 2 months. It backed up the river all the way to the Dalles. And that narrows now. When it finally washed out, it created a a rapids, a whitewater rapids called the Cascades. And that is what gave the name to the Cascade Range. It was this washout, the whitewater there, where the Bridge of the Gods had been. And now the Pacific Crest Trail crosses on the modern Bridge of the Gods and crosses the debris of the landslide, goes right up around Table Mountain. You can see the whole route of this legend as you do the hike. And it's now recovered as forest. It's been 700 years. But notice these giant boulders in the woods. These are blocks of Table Mountain. They're scattered all around out there. The trees have regrown, but there's a lot of big things and flowers too. These tiger lilies you'll see blooming all around there. And a very common plant in that area is pathfinder or arrowleaf. And this has its own native legend. The undersides of the leaves are this bright silver, and they're shaped like an arrow. So if a tenderfoot is traipsing through the woods, he'll leave a trail of silver arrows pointing the way he went. And that's why this is known as pathfinder plant. After a couple of miles up there, you'll reach the Gillette Lake. This makes a good turnaround point, but you're right in the middle of this landslide and can see up to the cliffs of Table Mountain. It's the legend of the Bridge of the Gods that turns out to have a geologic explanation as well. It was not a bridge. The Indians did not build bridges. They didn't have a word for bridge. They only had a word for cross dry-footed. And it was the pioneers who misunderstood, thinking it might be a bridge instead of what it really was a dam. Well, the first white explorers to cross Oregon were Lewis and Clark, and they did most of it in a canoe going down the Columbia River. Their goal was they were assigned to plant a United States flag at the mouth of the Columbia River to back up our country's rather feeble claim to the Oregon country. And they did that, and then spent the winter at Fort Clatsop, about 7 miles south of what is now Astoria. I was impressed reading their journals that they built this entire log fort in 2 weeks, considering it took my wife and me 20 years to build ours, using basically the same tools. So they knew what they were doing, but they didn't actually like Oregon that much. They complained about the weather. While they were there, they were in Oregon 112 days and complained in their journal that it rained all but 12. And Clark, who was the medical officer of that group, Lewis was in charge, technically, and Clark co-captain, but was really under him and had a medical background. He complained that the two things lacking in their diet in Oregon were salt and fat. Now, can you imagine a doctor today saying that what you really need more of is salt and fat? But he said, well, look, we're only 6 miles from the ocean. Why don't I go there and boil down seawater for salt? And Lewis said, yeah, get out of here. You've got cabin fever. You're driving me nuts. Go over to the beach and get salt. And so Clark and some men went to Seaside to boil down seawater and unfortunately got there before the bed and breakfast had opened. But they have a little city park there that has a replica of the fireplace where they boiled down seawater and got a quart of salt a day while they were there. But while they were there, they heard a story from the Indians in the area, and they said that a whale had beached on the other side of Tillamook Head, this big 1,000-foot-high headland. They said, yeah, if you hike over to the other side, you'll get to a beach and there'll be a whale. And Clark thought a whale would have blubber, and we could render the blubber down for fat. And so we'd have the salt and the fat we need to improve our diet, right? So he asked permission, again, had to get permission. And Lewis said, yes, go look for the whale, but please take Sacagawea. She is from Idaho, has never seen the ocean before or a whale, and she's gonna kill me if she doesn't get to go. So Clark and Sacagawea and 9 men hiked across Tillamook Head looking for a whale. That route has not really changed in 200 years. It is now the Oregon Coast Trail between Seaside and Cannon Beach, and along the way you pass a little sign that says Clark's Point of View, and it's thought this might be the spot that inspired Clark to write in his journal, I beheld here the grandest and most scenic panorama my eyes had yet beheld. High praise coming from him. On the far side, when they got to Cannon Beach, there was a whale there, a 100-foot long whale. It was entirely surrounded by Indians who were already carving it up for themselves and did not want to share. Clark had to bargain really hard to get a couple hundred pounds of oil, and they basically, Lewis and Clark left Oregon as quickly as they could, heading back across the country. And their report of this was so hair-raising that people thought it must be impossible to duplicate this, for anybody to go to Oregon. But they had chosen probably the most difficult route across the Rocky Mountains through northern Idaho. And later, they discovered an easier route through Wyoming where you could roll a wagon across the Rocky Mountains. And suddenly, a lot of people did this. The Oregon Trail became so popular that 0.1% of the entire population of the United States, 1 out of every 1,000 people, sold everything they owned, bought a wagon and oxen, and went 2,000 miles through the wilderness to come to Oregon. Those of you who are interested in Chamber of Commerce promotions for Oregon, if you could duplicate that, you'd be all set. But it turns out the real obstacles in Oregon were not the Rocky Mountains. It was the Blue Mountains and then the Cascade Range. And if you go to Baker City, they have an interpretive center there, and you can see the ruts and the wagon and all of that. But I wanted to talk today about 2 routes that are less well known that cross the McKenzie Pass. And these were sort of they were wagon roads, but not actually part of the Oregon Trail. They were built by people who lived in the Willamette Valley and wanted to get out. Because in the 1840s, a lot of people came to the Willamette Valley and there were farms all over. But in 1862, they discovered gold in eastern Oregon at John Day. And suddenly there were 10,000 miners in John Day in eastern Oregon that had tons of gold and no food. Meanwhile, here in the Willamette Valley, there were all these farmers who had lots of food and no gold. So Captain Felix Scott from Eugene decided he would build a wagon road going the other way, from Eugene over the mountains to the gold fields, and take along 500 head of cattle and a bunch of flour and get rich. So he started building. That was Scott Lake, by the way, named for Captain Felix Scott. His route today is known as the Scott Trail, going across the Three Sisters Wilderness from Scott Lake, which is named for him. But he hired 50 wagon road builders and 28 wagons and 400 head of cattle, and started building a trail up the McKenzie River. If you've driven that road, you know it has giant trees, there's rivers to cross. But the big obstacle was when they got to McKenzie Pass and realized that the route ahead crosses 4 miles of lava. Jagged lava. If you drive across McKenzie Pass today, you can hardly get out of the car and walk a foot. It's so jagged. They could not get the cattle across that. And so Scott said, we'll go around the lava. And so the route he built detours and crosses the lava at its narrowest point. It's only 100 yards wide there. Goes past 4 on one cone and goes over Scott Pass. And this is a very beautiful route even today, but it's not the route that the highway takes because it's 1,000 feet higher than McKenzie Pass. When you do this route, you'll pass 4 in one cone, 4 little cinder cones. This is the view from the top there. You can see the lava flow down here that they crossed, and north and middle sister. Just beyond is the crest. This is where the Scott Trail crosses the Pacific Crest Trail, a very beautiful place with flowers and still very lovely. But it was not a very good route for that wagon road because it was too high. And one of the wagon builders on his crew was named John Templeton Craig. And he complained the whole time saying, you're building it in the wrong spot. You should have built through the lava down low. And so 7 years later, he came back and built a second wagon road across McKenzie Pass through the lava. With a pick and a shovel, he leveled that spot by hand. That route is still visible today. It's hardly changed. You can walk this part across the lava here near Hand Lake. He was so proud of this road, John Templeton Craig, was that he bragged he could keep it open all year round. Of course, you can't do that because they get 10 feet of snow in the winter up there. But he bid on the contract to carry mail across the pass on his wagon road between McKenzie Bridge and Sisters and won the contract and then had to do it. So he put on skis, and every 2 weeks he would ski across McKenzie Pass taking mail from the west side to the east side to Sisters. And he did that until 1877, when he set out just before Christmas and was never seen alive again. He had built a cabin up there on the pass. This is not his cabin, but it probably looks a lot like it. This is the Hand Lake Shelter right next to that route, also up there still. They set up a search party. It was turned back by storms. They had to wait until spring. When they could finally get up there, they found him frozen to death in his cabin beside his sack of mail, which is one example, I guess, of where snow and sleet really did stop the mail from getting through. But the determination of this die-hard skiing mailman has inspired generations of skiers. The Oregon Nordic Club, since 1930, has held an annual John Templeton Craig Memorial Ski Race across McKenzie Pass. You can do this. You can join them if you'd like. It's the first Sunday in April. They have snowmobiles that have sag wagon stuff along the way, and you don't have to do the whole 18 miles, but a lot of people do, and they often carry mail with them. The Sisters Post Office has a special cancellation mark that is only used on mail that has been carried across the pass on skis. So even if you don't do the hike or ski, you can collect the mail going back to the 1930s, canceled in memory of the skiing mailman who did not believe that the Scott Trail was the right route across the Cascade Range. Well, Oregon's coast is pretty rugged. In fact, we have no natural harbors, nothing like Puget Sound or San Francisco Bay. And so there were a lot of shipwrecks on the Oregon coast. And in the 1860s, Congress authorized money to build 12 lighthouses up and down the Oregon coast to try to cut down on the shipwrecks and the deaths. And if there was only money for 12 lighthouses, why is it that Newport got 2 of them? Well, they will contend this if you go to Newport and talk to them there, but the answer really is that there was a government mix-up. The first lighthouse was built right where you think it should be. This is the Yaquina Bay Lighthouse, right at the mouth of Yaquina Bay. Notice that they put the light itself on the building where the lighthouse keeper lives, so he could go up from his bed and trim the wick. Very handy. But this lighthouse only was operational for 3 years because they built the other lighthouse too close. Well, okay, this is a sandcastle right below the Yaquina Bay Lighthouse, but on the horizon you can see the other one, the Yaquina Head Lighthouse. It's only 3 air miles away, and it's the tallest lighthouse in Oregon, but its official name was the Cape Foulweather Lighthouse. It wasn't supposed to be built here. It was supposed to be built 10 miles further north on Cape Foulweather, except when the parts arrived for this, and they came in a big ship, all the parts for a lighthouse kit. It arrived in Newport, and the local Army captain said, "You can't build it at Cape Foulweather. The weather's too foul. Let's build it right here. We can get our wagons out there. It'll be so much easier." So they built it there, and when they turned it on, the 2 lights were so close together that they were actually confusing. And so they turned off the Yaquina Bay Lighthouse and now only have this one, which still operates. And you know, every lighthouse in Oregon is haunted. The ghost story for this one I don't believe is true. They say that as they were building it, there were 2 walls, an outer wall and an inner wall, and a worker fell in between them, and then rather than try to get him out because they couldn't, they just built it, and he moans inside the walls. I don't believe that's true, but a lot of the other lighthouses do have ghost stories, and some of them you wonder about. This is the most photographed lighthouse in Oregon. It's just north of Florence, the Heceta Head Lighthouse. This is another one where you have to hike to go a little bit. You do have to hike to get there. And there are 2 ways. You can start at what used to be called the Devil's Elbow State Park, and that's a half mile. But they charge a $5 parking fee there. You know, and this is no longer named that. because of a ruling from the state parks here in Salem. At some point about 10 years ago, they wanted to eliminate satanic references from state park names, and so decided to rename the Devil's Elbow State Park, which had originally been named for the devilish current in this elbow of the sea here. And instead, it is now named the Heceta Head Lighthouse Viewpoint Wayside. So I prefer the old name. Anyway, if you don't want to pay the $5, park over here. It's actually a prettier trail with better viewpoints, a little bit longer, but free, and you wind up at the lighthouse. And they have volunteers that will take you up there and show you the Fresnel lens. This is the original lens. It's actually a marvel of engineering from the days before electricity. Okay, they needed to have a light that would cast a beam 20 miles out to sea and rotate. How do you do that without an electric light or an electric motor? Well, a physicist in Paris named Fresnel came up with a system of using up to 1,000 hand-ground prisms that can refract the light from a single kerosene wick and throw it in a beam 20 miles out to sea. But you need to make that move, and this thing weighs a ton. How do you get it to rotate? Well, it still revolves on little brass bearings, and you can turn the whole thing with your finger. But you need to be able to do that all the time. And the system that they used was the same as is used for cuckoo clocks. You know how in a cuckoo clock it has a weight and you crank up, and as the weight slowly goes down, it turns the gears and moves the clock? Well, they had the same thing in this tower, except it was much bigger. And every 4 hours, the lighthouse keeper or his 2 assistants would have to go and crank up the weights. As they slowly went down, it would swing the beam around and flash that 20 miles out to sea. A marvel of engineering. You can also stay the night there in the lighthouse keeper assistant's duplex. The lighthouse keeper's building was a little closer to the lighthouse. It was torn down. But the duplex where his 2 assistants lived is owned by the state and leased out as a bed and breakfast. And it's not cheap. It's a couple $100s a night, but wow, what a view. It is amazing. And you're right there by the ocean. It is a spectacular bed and breakfast. The one thing I would counsel against is renting the room that I took that faces the lighthouse. Because every 12 seconds all night, this giant beam comes in the window. It's like having a flash bulb go off over and over. The woman before me wrote in the guest log, "I felt like I was at a Hollywood premiere all night." The other drawback to that room is that its closet has the staircase that leads to the attic where the ghost lives. And Rue is supposed to creak on the 7th step of that stair every at night. Well, that legend goes back to the 1960s when Lane Community College was using this for their summer seminars, and they had 20 college kids in this building, poorly supervised, smoking marijuana and playing with a Ouija board. And the Ouija board spelled out R-U-E, and they decided this was a ghost speaking to them. Well, since then, people swear that they've seen this woman in a long gown looking for a daughter, and basically she goes around unlocking doors and stealing and misplacing things, and anything that goes wrong at the bed and breakfast is the fault of Rue. But I don't know about her pedigree either. Well, there are other lighthouses that deserve to have more ghosts than they do. This is the one at Bandon, the Coquille River Lighthouse, and it was one of the earliest ones built in Oregon. It was built right on the rock that they didn't want ships to hit, and as a result, it is the only lighthouse in Oregon that has been struck by a ship. The lighthouse with the most ghosts per square inch, though, would be the Tillamook Rock Lighthouse. This is offshore from Tillamook Head. Remember the headland that Lewis and Clark hiked over looking for a whale? Well, the Coast Guard wanted to build a lighthouse on top of that headland, and it's 1,000 feet high, and the locals said, no, it's often foggy here. Your light would be above the fog. You have to build it down low. And the engineers looked around, and the only place down low they could find was this island a mile offshore. It turned out to be a really hard place to build a lighthouse. The first surveyor that they landed here in a dory boat stepped off and was immediately washed away by a wave and killed. It took a while to hire another surveyor. When they did, he came up with a different plan for getting his workers to the island. He anchored a ship over here and strung a cable over to the island, and then he had his workers suit up in a heavy suit with pulleys on the shoulders. This is called a breeches buoy system. And he hung them on the wire and sent them zinging over to the island. Nobody actually died using this system, but it wasn't all that popular either, because as the ship went up and down with the waves, the workers would alternately be dragged through the surf or snapped in the air as if by a rubber band. When they finally got there, it took them 6 months to dynamite a flat spot for the lighthouse, and then another 6 months to build it. And when they were done, the light was 140 feet above sea level. The engineers said that'll be plenty high. But then almost every winter, gigantic storms off the North Pacific would crash over the island and smash the glass up there 140 feet high, hurl rocks, seaweed, and even fish into the lantern room. This became the most feared outpost in the Coast Guard. They called it Terrible Tilly. And when finally a storm in 1930s smashed the lens itself, the Coast Guard gave up and replaced the whole thing with a whistling buoy. And then, in the 1950s, they decided to sell the whole thing as surplus government property. Well, so they put it up for auction. Didn't know who would bid on an island that you can only get to by helicopter, and a lighthouse that is really hard to maintain out there. The highest bidder was the owner of a Las Vegas casino. No, it was not Trump, no. But the casino owner quickly realized that his plan to put a casino out there would not work because you can't get people to it. So it later sold a couple of times and wound up with Eternity at Sea. And this was a funeral business that catered to the needs of people who want to be buried on a lighthouse when they die. For $2,000, they said they would take an urn with your ashes and fly it out there and put it in the lighthouse. The problem was there's no way to check up if they were really doing this. And so finally the State Mortuary Board here in Salem, there is such a board. Anybody on it? Nobody knows it? Yeah. Well, they became suspicious and hired a helicopter and went out and looked. And it turns out, yeah, the urns are there, but they're covered with 6 inches of guano, bird droppings. And this did not meet their high standards. So they shut that down. You can't do that anymore, Eternity at Sea, but I still think there are more ghosts per square inch at Tillamook Rock than at any other lighthouse in Oregon. Well, the Boomiers were in the early 1900s. All of the really fancy, nice houses in Salem and Portland were built between 1900 and 1929, including the Pittock Mansion in Portland, fabulous mansion, but they couldn't build houses on the beach because there was no road or railroad in the early 1900s over to the coast. And so a real estate developer from Kansas City named T.B. Potter bought the Tillamook Bay Peninsula, this sand spit between Tillamook and the ocean, and announced that he was going to build the Queen Resort of the American West out there called Bay Ocean. How did he get people there? Well, he bought a steamship, a beautiful white steamship that sailed once a week from Portland past Astoria and would come around here. And when the weather was good, it could get across the bar and dock there. And they built a lot. I mean, this became the 3rd largest city on the Oregon coast. This was the largest saltwater swimming pool on the west coast. It had the natatorium had a wave machine inside. It was heated and had a band shell to perform while you swam. This is one of the dance halls. The picture's taken from one of the 2 hotels. There were 500 houses. It was a big town. But it didn't have this very good access anyway, because if the weather wasn't good, that ship had to anchor out here and shuttle people through the surf in dories. Yeah, not your nice way to start your vacation. So the town father said what they really need to make Bay Ocean take off was to build a jetty out here at the mouth of the bay so that the ship could get in all weather. And they didn't know how right they were about making the town take off, because when they built the jetty, it changed the ocean currents and washed the entire city away. Street by street, Bay Ocean fell into the sea. First went the natatorium, then both hotels. The only houses that were saved were moved by house movers over to Cape Meares, where a few survived. if you hike today, there is no physical trace of the city left. This is wreckage from a fishing boat. And as a result, I think Bay Ocean is the prettiest town on the Oregon coast. No garish motels or casinos or signs. It's just bird watching and beach. And it makes a lovely hike to go see the site of a town built on sand. Maybe there's a lesson there about building your town on sand, and maybe about the impermanence of any building, but especially on the Oregon coast, where we now know there are also tsunamis. So that early part of the 1900s was also a boom time for the forests, when they started building fire lookouts. And this one you can still visit. It's the oldest fire lookout left in Oregon, on top of Black Butte, with a view of Three Finger Jack. And it's just a nice hike up there to visit one of the fire lookouts. I have stories about many fire lookouts in the book, but today I want instead to focus on the lead up to World War II and World War II. The Great Depression ravaged Oregon. Half the banks failed, a third of the population was unemployed, but it was a time of optimism in the forests. The Civilian Conservation Corps employed 2 million men to build campgrounds and trails in the western forests. And they also helped build Timberline Lodge. This was a pretty daring thing, to build a 5-star hotel way up high on Timberline Lodge in the Depression. Who's going to go there? But they hired artists and craftsmen, and they put their heart into this building. It became a grand expression of Northwest art. Here they carved the head of a ram, here the head of a buffalo, and here the head of their mascot. They've had a Heidi or a Bruno all along, and the dogs are there to, soften the image, to get people to encourage to go up there. The other thing they did, because, who'd go to way up high on a mountain in the Depression? The other thing they did was to build a ski resort, the first ski resort in America with a chairlift. The Magic Mile chairlift went 1 mile up to the Silcox Hut, where the machinery was, to turn it around. They brought in the King of Norway in 1939 to demonstrate skiing in America, because nobody knew what it was. Later, of course, they moved the Magic Mile over here, and it's now a high-speed quad. And that building was left as a ruin for 50 years, with snow blowing through the roof. But a group called the Friends of the Silcox Hut restored it and opened it up in its former glory and better. They hired blacksmiths and carpenters in the style of Timberline Lodge, and it is now an extension of the lodge, but cheaper. You can rent the Silcox Hut. It's got bunks for $20. If you do, it's less per person than Timberline Lodge. They send up their own chef for you to cook breakfast and dinner. And if you don't want to walk up there, you can get a ticket on the Magic Mile and ride it, or they'll take you up in a snowmobile. But it has a fabulous view out to Mount Jefferson and the Three Sisters and down to Timberline Lodge, sort of a bright spot in the Depression. But then came World War II, and the Forest Army, the CCC, became a real army. And we don't often think of this in Oregon, but Oregon was on the front line of World War II. After the Japanese bombed Hawaii in December of 1941, the U.S. military seriously believed that the Japanese might invade the mainland U.S. And if they did, they would land in Oregon. It's closest to Japan. It's not very heavily populated and poorly defended. So they set about defending Oregon. And they started by beefing up the gun emplacements at Fort Stevens at the mouth of the Columbia River. They installed guns with an 8-mile range out there to blast away anything that would threaten the mouth of the Columbia River. But then a Japanese submarine really did surface at the mouth of the Columbia River, and on its deck it had a gun with a 9-mile range. So it lobbed 27 shells at Fort Stevens, and the commanders there decided not to fire back because they'd just give away their location. So the Army gave up on these gun emplacements and shifted their strategy for defending Oregon instead to blimps, to dirigibles. Pretty radical shift. They built 2 of these blimp hangars. One remains at Tillamook. It may not look that big, but it was the largest wooden building in the world. It's 14 stories tall and a quarter-mile long. It now houses a museum of World War II aircraft and is so big that the planes can fly indoors. But it housed 4 blimps during the war, and these would patrol up and down the coast looking for that submarine if it should come back. And it did come back. And they didn't catch it. And the story behind that is really the story of Nobuo Fujita. And to understand how they did this with this secret weapon, you have to know a little bit about technology in World War II. We had sonar and radar. The Japanese did not. That was a huge disadvantage. Their submarines couldn't tell where ships were to torpedo them while they were underwater. So each sub had an airplane on it in a waterproof hangar. And when the sub surfaced, they'd open the door, roll out the plane, screw on the pontoons, and bolt on the wings, and launch it off this ramp like a slingshot. And it would fly around and radio back the locations of ships to torpedo. Then it would land on the pontoons, and they'd hoist it with his derrick, put it back on the deck, stuff it in and then go down and start torpedoing ships. Well, the plane could also carry 1 bomb. And the pilot, Nobuo Fujita, after shelling Fort Stevens, they went all the way back to Japan. He suggested to the Japanese that they use his plane to bomb the Panama Canal or the Seattle airport. They took him very seriously. He was called before, actually, go back here. He was called before the Prince of Japan and the Admiral of the Japanese Navy. Lieutenant Fujita must have been shaking in his boots. They told him, "Lieutenant, we admire your courage. We like your plan, but it has one flaw. Your plane is made out of plywood and canvas. It can be outflown by a fast bird. You have no chance of penetrating the air defenses of Seattle or Panama. You'd be shot down immediately. So instead, we're going to give you 2 incendiary bombs and have you bomb the Kalmiopsis wilderness of southern Oregon." And he goes, "What? A wilderness? Why?" We said, "Well, it's kind of close to the shore, and it has a big forest. If you start a forest fire, that will detract from the war effort." He goes, "Whatever." So they sail all the way back across the ocean. He gets across the coast without being spotted by the blimps. He drops his bomb on Wheeler Ridge. It blows up. Now, you have to imagine what it would have been like to be the fire lookout on Mount Emily that morning, 6 miles away. It was 8 o'clock in the morning. He was pouring a cup of coffee. He looks out. Here comes a Japanese plane. It drops a bomb. It blows up. He calls up the Army Air Force Command in Roseburg and says, "This could be the invasion that you're talking about. The Japanese have attacked. Send a squadron of fighters." And they said, "Okay, what is the location of the nearest airport?" I said, "Well, there aren't any airports very close. The closest one is in North Bend." And this is true. Coos Bay does not have its own airport, but the adjacent city of North Bend does. So he said, "Yeah, I'm south of North Bend." So they sent a squadron of fighters to the city of Bend, Oregon, where there were no submarines. And Nobuo Fujita escaped unharmed. But what about the bomb? Well, it did blow up, but it landed in a redwood grove, and redwoods are fireproof. So it left a crater, but didn't really start a fire. Okay, well, 40 years go by, and this top secret attack is now declassified. The Forest Service decides to build a 1-mile trail to the bomb site. And they think, who better to invite for the grand opening of the trail than the pilot who dropped the bomb? They found Mr. Fujita. He was 80 years old in Japan and had some misgivings about this invitation to come back. He thought it might be a ruse to put him on trial as a war criminal. So he brought with him his family's 300-year-old samurai sword. And you could just do that in those days, walk onto a plane with a 3-foot sword. You know, you want to have that on your lap or in the overhead bin. But his plan was to commit ritual suicide if they were to accuse him of a war crime. But instead, they welcomed him as an ambassador of peace. He planted a redwood seedling in his crater as an apology, and then he donated his family's sword to the city of Brookings, where it hangs in the library to this day. You know, I think that all trails have a message of peace, but this one is a particularly strong message, and it was driven home, I think, here just this last month, because the Chetco Bar Fire burned 200,000 acres in this area, swept over this ridge. The firefighters saved this tree and the trail, specifically because of its importance. I think, you know, that it's important that we remember Oregon's history. It is not just the history of the state, 150 years. We go back 14,000 years, and the people who were there then are still here. The DNA shows that their descendants are the Native Americans who live in Oregon today. We have to be careful with our heritage here. We can easily destroy it. And I think the key really is to understand Oregon's history. And the key to that is not just museums. I mean, museums can have a butter churn and a wagon wheel, but you will never get the feel of Lewis and Clark looking for that whale, Chief Joseph leaving Oregon on his Trail of Tears. To understand that, you have to get out and walk. And I don't know what Oregon might look like in another 14,000 years. Maybe there'll be another ice age. Maybe it's already started. But I think that people will judge us then, not by the things we've built, but by the things we've left alone. And that they too will have to go hiking to really understand Oregon's history. And that's my talk. So I'm afraid I've only left us 3 minutes for questions because I got carried away with my story. But perhaps we have time for a couple of quick ones. In the front, loud.
In 1941, the Oregon State won the Pacific Coast Conference. I forget what it's called then, but they had a transplant the Rose Bowl in Durham, North Carolina, because they were afraid of the Japanese.
The Rose Bowl was moved from Oregon to California.
Durham, I think it's.
In 1941.
Yeah, it was Oregon State against Duke.
In order to protect against a possible Japanese attack. Yes, okay. As we say, they seriously believed that the Japanese might actually invade and conquer Oregon. And here we are in their university, so.
Well, I think we've run out of time. It's
right.
Anne. But I want to thank you. Your knowledge of this state is exceeded only by the wonderful way you develop.